is Regina Davis, NARUC's Director of Communications, and welcome to today's NARUC Sponsor Spotlight. Today we'll learn more about Anterix. And Anterix is the company that's architecting a new foundation for critical infrastructure with wireless broadband private LTE. Now, that may sound like a big undertaking, but we're very fortunate that we have someone here who can tell us a lot more about that, exactly what it means. So we're so pleased today to be joined by Rob Schwartz, President and CEO of Anterix. And before we dive into this conversation, Rob, I'd like to thank you so much for being a sponsor of NARUC. And we always appreciate it when you can stop by, even virtually, and have a little conversation with us and let us know what's going on with Anterix. So briefly, can you provide us an introduction and overview of Anterix?
Absolutely, and thanks, Regina. I'm honored to be here as part of this important NARUC event, and we're always proud to be part of the sponsorship when we can. Thanks. Excited to speak to both you and all the commissioners and the attendees of the conference. So Anterix, we're focused on building a company that enables utilities to build, own, and operate their own private wireless broadband networks. And so why that matters, right? These are systems that need to be secure, they need to be resilient, they need to be utility controlled so that they can build them in the way that supports all of the significant requirements of the changes that are happening in the electric grid. We're uniquely positioned to do this because we own a nationwide spectrum position at what's of 900 megahertz. This is spectrum that we're licensed to the FCC and is an essential foundational element to be able to build private wireless networks. And utilities are very familiar with operating communications networks. They've done so for decades, typically, historically, narrowband networks that serve single purposes within the infrastructure. But as the world is modernizing, the electric grid is modernizing with all the growing requirements of cybersecurity, resiliency, reliability, and all the new use cases that are coming forward to be able to put in renewable energy, to be able to focus on decarbonization goals, to be able to deal with all of the new incidents of wildfires and other man-made and natural disasters. It's essential to have a communications layer to be able to do that, and that's what we at Anterix are working with utilities to provide.
Okay, so that sounds like it could be a big undertaking. And you've given us some good foundation and some good structure for that. However, why specifically should NARUC and its members really want to focus on this issue of private broadband for utilities?
It's a great question. So first of all, the founders of Anterix are the founders of Nextel. You know, we built what was one of the first nationwide communications infrastructure, mobile wireless infrastructure that was specifically focused on better serving the industrial users that weren't being served at the time by the commercial offerings. And so using that understanding of that and also the value of the spectrum as the foundation, we really have realized that in order for the grid to be able to be improved in all the ways that are necessary, right? All the changes that are occurring, between the requirements to be able to plug in all of these new capabilities with renewable energy and to meet decarbonization goals, with the requirement now to be able to, from a security standpoint, have sensors and monitors throughout the network. There are tens and tens of thousands of new sensors that have to be deployed within what was the historical grid to be able to allow it to be secure and resilient the way it needs to be. And these are elements that are being deployed in places where there aren't other alternatives. The other important thing that brings up is the need for rural broadband. As these networks are being built, the infrastructure, the middle mile infrastructure, the middle mile wireless that's being deployed in these networks is foundational to be able to build upon, to be able to serve rural communities with broadband services. Because as these networks get built by utilities, they're putting in fiber, they're putting in towers, they're putting in the infrastructure that enables all of the rural entities that serve those communities to be able to leverage off of that investment in infrastructure.
Oh, okay. That's very good. So just to continue this thread, then, as many of us know, many utilities are looking at wireless broadband solutions for critical grid communications. So given your focus in this area, is there a technology and an approach that you favor? And if so, why?
Yeah. So historically, the communications infrastructure has been fragmented with different technologies, different solution sets. I always compare it to our mobile phones. Today, in a 4G LTE environment going to 5G, all of the applications of that phone you used to own a different device for. You had a record player, an MP3 player, a CD player that brought you your music. You had a flashlight that you used for lighting. You had a push to talk two-way radio in a truck. All those things come together into a single device, and that's very similar to what we're proposing here. We're using LTE, the same LTE technology that's being utilized around the globe by all the wireless carriers. And so by converging onto that standard technology, utilities can get the economies of scale and scope and follow that R&D curve to allow them to get the same benefits that honestly our kids get as they're using these devices and watching YouTube and streaming videos. But when a utility goes on that network, they don't get priority against any other users. Here, the other key word in LTE is the technology is private. Private is because when a utility builds this network, and again, utilities have been building private networks for the resiliency they require for decades. Now going to LTE, the standard technology in a private environment, they can do so and be forward compatible with all these new requirements and applications. And so the ability to put out, as I said, thousands and thousands of sensors to be able to understand when solar is being generated intermittently on a rooftop, knowing when to turn that on and off. When there's a tree limb that falls on a wire and you want to be able to turn that power off on that line before it hits the ground and starts a wildfire. So there's so many use cases that are coming to bear, and those use cases become applications on this LTE network, and private because it allows them to build it how they want it, where they want it, with the level of reliability, and importantly, the prioritization of their usage as well.
Those are some very good examples that you cited, in particular with respect to wildfires. And there's so many folks who are looking at that right now. They're very good applications that you cited here. So let's move on to my next question. And so Anterix believes that a broad adoption of private LTE technology could create what's known as a network effect. So my understanding of network effect is that there's incremental benefit gained by an existing user each time new users join the network. I don't know how close I am to what that really means, but can you explain it in more detail?
Yeah, no, Regina, you're spot on. So, right, the network effect of this network of networks. So think about each utility being a network, an element on a broader network. And so while they, on a standalone basis, have a fully resilient system on their own, the more entities in a network effect that connect within that network, the more powerful it gets for a number of reasons. One is just the scale, right? The economies of scale of utilities driving technology vendors, applications to adopt this on a holistic basis. Today, as I said, a lot of the communications technology are fragmented, so you have fragmented development and not the scale that could occur. There's actually a group that's been formed that we're a founding member of, along with a number of utilities like Ameren and NIPA and Southern Company, called the Utility Broadband Alliance. And so it's an entity where the collective of utilities is already starting to show this value of a network of networks. And, you know, when one utility has done a pilot, they've come forward and shared that information with the other utilities. When one goes through a vendor negotiation or wants to try out a new use case, they have a collective effort to do that. And so, you know, we've seen utilities that are going through the process of approving devices and technologies on their own. And then we go visit 5 other utilities and see them doing exactly the same thing. And so the collective value of them working together, first in understanding the application, but it really goes way beyond that. Once you have these operating networks, you have the equivalent of mutual aid, right? When trucks roll between territories, why shouldn't they be on an interoperable technology that works between them? When you have cybersecurity incidences that are occurring on the same kind of technology, it's a much quicker response time. And this LTE, talking about cyber, this LTE technology was really built with a significant amount of cyber capabilities already in it. But then as utilities deploy these networks, they can collectively understand how to layer on as much additional cyber requirements they have as the networks are being deployed. So the collective action, you know, has already begun with the Utility Broadband Alliance, and we see it continuing to grow as more and more utilities lean into this private LTE universe to be able to generate the scale capabilities across the industry.
Okay, so you mentioned cybersecurity, and as you know, cybersecurity is very important to NARUC and its members because, of course, we push out papers, we have webinars, trainings, et cetera, devoted to cyber, not to mention that we do have our Committee on Critical Infrastructure focused on cybersecurity. And as I listen to you talking today, it seems like you're uniquely poised for cybersecurity. So can you talk even more specifically about how exactly the private LTE helps with cybersecurity?
Sure. So if you think about the energy grid, a foundational layer underneath that needs to be a communications grid, right? The ability to command and control all the elements in the network today and into the future is essential. And so that level of control, the security of that control is paramount, right? Not having any nefarious parties have the ability to have any points of entry or control, but also equivalently having as many points of monitoring as possible along that network. And so that's not something you'd want to put on a public network, a network where people can go into a corner store and buy a device on that network. Instead, the idea, and again, this is not something we founded, this has been a principle of longstanding within the utility industry, having a private network that's owned and controlled by the utility. And so private LTE is an evolution of that idea. It's using the newest and best technology for that, which is much more secure. LTE itself as a global standard has immense amount of native cybersecurity capabilities built into it, what all the carriers use when you're a customer, and it's very strong. But on top of that, when you're a utility and you build it, we've seen examples like this, the way Southern Company, for example, has deployed their private LTE network. You have the ability to put precisely what you need in addition. If you want device level cybersecurity, you want to be able to do a certain level of monitoring or deployment. And you have to realize that the key piece of it is it's separated from the public internet, right? When you're on a public network, inherently you have your smartphone because you can go on the internet. But this is the opposite. You want to have an air gap network, a network that's gapped from the public internet. So anyone who's on the public internet has no points of access into your network. And that's one of the fundamental aspects as well that make a private LTE network cyber secure.
Very good. Well, as you know, our NARUC theme this year is Bridging the Divide. And commissioners are very focused on closing the digital divide so that all citizens have access to broadband. So how does Anterix view that issue?
Yeah.
So and actually, is there anything that you can do to help address this problem?
Absolutely. It's a critical issue in the country, and it's only exacerbated by obviously the pandemic that we're going through with COVID-19. Right. Just pointing out the essential need of communications to the home, to schools, to hospitals and other essential locations. As I said, we've been in the telecommunications business for a long time and built national networks. And what's the gap that's missing beyond the service is the infrastructure. And as utilities look at it, utilities have a vast amount of fiber, the middle mile fiber that's deployed between important elements. But as networks need to now expand beyond that, it's about middle mile wireless in our view. So, and to get there, you have to build the infrastructure on which you've seen cell sites, those towers, the cabinetry, the work that's done to pull fiber to the places where it doesn't exist today. The private LTE networks we're talking about can be the foundation for that. So as a utility builds out a system and deploys it to cover their entire service territory and can absolutely justify that from a cost standpoint and a value standpoint for their customers of building that network to manage their network the way I talked about, that's the same infrastructure. That's the majority of the fixed cost in order to build rural broadband. And so as utilities build that infrastructure, and we're talking to a number of utilities that we're working with through pilots, we have over a half dozen different experimental licenses that have been granted by the FCC and that are being deployed. That's the exact infrastructure that broadband, rural broadband needs to be built upon. And so those utilities are already working with rural broadband providers to be able to, they're often called WISPs, wireless broadband providers, to be able to put infrastructure on those towers, leveraging off that fiber that's being built to be able to serve those communities that are underserved today. And so it's a two-step process, and this is a difficult thing. I can imagine how challenging it is to be a commissioner and have to understand, suddenly get a PhD in telecom to get, the understanding of how these elements work. But if you just think about the physical infrastructure that's required to build this private LTE network, it's precisely the kind of infrastructure as the core foundational element you need in order to serve those communities with rural broadband. And that's both wired and wireless.
So tell me, what's unique about your spectrum offering for utilities?
Yeah, so spectrum is a scarce asset. A lot of it over the past decades has been gone through auctions at the FCC and mostly consumed, purchased by the wireless carriers that offer great businesses, having been in that business ourselves decades ago. However, the low band of the spectrum, which we call the beachfront property, is really the kind of spectrum that you need in order to serve vast geographies like the service territories of utilities. And all of that spectrum, the low band spectrum, has really already been granted by the FCC. So Anterix, we went through a process, over a 5-year process, to get spectrum, repurpose underutilized spectrum to be able to bring this broadband spectrum uniquely to market. But it's a scarce asset, and it's something that we're very proud of what we achieved, but we're really focused, laser focused on being able to use that spectrum to enable these broadband networks for utilities. And there's not really much of it, if any, left. And so the need to really move quickly and expediently as an industry, that's another place where the collective is essential, that the opportunity to really standardize and harmonize around this band for the industry, we think is something that's very important. We're already seeing that happening as the industry is coming together in realizing both the requirements and need for it, but also the supply and demand side, that this is a scarce asset and there needs to be the ability to move forward on it as soon as possible.
So can Anterix lease 900 megahertz broadband spectrum to utilities today?
We can. So we have this nationwide footprint of spectrum. We're already working with over 40 different utilities across the country. And we're having the conversations of not just about the spectrum. The spectrum is really the foundation that enables these networks, and it's an essential piece. Without it, you can't build a private wireless network. You can use shared spectrum, you can use commercial networks, but it's really an essential element. But it's really about the use cases and the solution that it brings collectively. So we're working with multiple vendors. One of the benefit of selecting LTE is it's a global standard, and you can go to a universe of vendors. You can go to Nokia, to Ericsson, to Motorola, Samsung. There's plenty of choice, both on the infrastructure side, and there are thousands of endpoints available. The kind of phones that we have in our pockets are available on that band, and there's all kinds of fixed wireless devices to be able to do the kind of command and control that utilities need as well.
Well, as you just mentioned, that spectrum is scarce and it's a finite resource. So should utilities be concerned that they won't be able to get the spectrum that they need?
Well, I think it's a window of opportunity as I see it right now. If you were looking for this spectrum a year or two ago, it was not available. So the FCC in May put out a final report and order which changed the way in which the spectrum we have is usable, and now it can be used for these kinds of networks. So the window of opportunity is open. How long that window is going to be open, there's a single license in any given marketplace, and so the need to really be able to act now to be able to understand both the necessity for it within the industry, but also the collective opportunity to work together on it.
Wow, that's good. Good information. And so now as we are coming close to the conclusion of our chat today, I'm interested that for NARUC members and participants to our conference who are listening to this, how can they learn more about private LTE? Because we've gone over so much information very quickly, and we hope that we've whet folks' appetite and that they would want to learn more about private LTE. What's next? What should they do next?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. There's a few good options. Well, one is I mentioned the Utility Broadband Alliance, and that's ubba.com. That's an alliance of utilities, now over a dozen utilities, vendors. We're a founding member as well. It's a great place to go to hear from fellow utilities about how they've done it, how they've approached it, and it's a sharing community. It's a great place to start the education. Obviously, Anterix, we're happy to talk more about it as well. We've got a website available at anterix.com, reaching out to any of the Anterix contacts throughout this conference as well. And I also, urge the members of NARUC to really understand how to work collectively with it. So we're reaching out to as many commissioners and states to really just educate about these issues. We're passionate about telecommunications. We've used it to solve key problems over the past decades, and we really see the need for a private broadband LTE network, utility by utility, that when you connect that into a collective, that network effect is going to bring tremendous value to our nation's electric grid in making it really secure, reliable, and resilient.
Well, thank you so much, Rob Schwartz, President and CEO of Anterix, for joining NARUC today. Rob, this was a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today, and hopefully you can come back and talk some more as we learn more about what you're doing. Once again, thank you so much for being a great sponsor of NARUC.
Thank you, Regina, so much for the opportunity. And again, good luck for having a great conference. Thank you.
Great.